in the peaceful, secluded town of Keddie, California, where the dense Sierra Nevada forest stood as a silent guardian, life seemed calm and uneventful. The year was 1981, and nestled among the trees was the small Keddie Resort, home to a scattering of families trying to live quietly in the shadow of nature. One of those families was the Sharps, a mother and her 5 children, trying to build a new life after leaving their old one behind. But on a cool April night, something unthinkable would unfold in their modest home, forever changing the quiet reputation of Keddie. Glenna Susan Sue Sharp had relocated from Connecticut to California in 1979, bringing her children to this rural community after splitting from her husband. Sue was strong, independent, and determined to make things work for her family. She rented Cabin 28, a simple but spacious house, larger than the trailer they had previously called home. For Sue, this was a fresh start, a chance to rebuild with her 5 kids: John, 15, Sheila, 14, Tina, 12, Rick, 10, and Greg, 5. Life in Keddie had settled into a quiet routine. The kids attended school, played outside, and made friends. It was a tight-knit community where people looked out for one another. And despite being isolated from the bustling world, there was a sense of security in the remoteness. But that sense of security would soon shatter. April 11th, 1981 began like any other Saturday. Sue took her kids out for a trip to nearby Quincy, a small town just a few miles down the road. They stopped by the house of family friends, the Meeks, and picked up John and his close friend, Dana Wingate, who had been out hitchhiking. Hitchhiking wasn't unusual in this area. It was how people got around in these small towns. Sue drove the boys back to Keddie, where they had planned to hang out for the rest of the day. By all accounts, it was a typical spring day, with no hint of the tragedy that would soon unfold. Later that evening, Sheila made plans to stay the night at a neighbor's house just across the way at Cabin 27. Sue remained at home with Rick, Greg, and Justin Smart, a young friend who had been invited for a sleepover. John and Dana were also at the house, seemingly settling in for a quiet night. Tina, who had been watching TV at the neighbor's house with Sheila, came back home around 9:30 p.m. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. But the next morning, Sunday, April 12th, the Sharp family's world, and the world of everyone in Keddie, would be thrown into a nightmare. Sheila woke early and made her way home. When she opened the front door to Cabin 28, she was greeted by a sight so horrific that it would haunt her for the rest of her life. Inside, the living room was chaotic. Furniture was overturned, and there were clear signs of a violent struggle. But worse were the bodies. Sue, John, and Dana were there, lifeless and bound with medical tape. Their lives had ended in brutal and incomprehensible ways. Panicking, Sheila ran back to her neighbors, screaming for help. The Seabolt family, with whom she had spent the night, came rushing over. They quickly removed Rick, Greg, and Justin from the home through a bedroom window, finding the boys unharmed but deeply shaken. Yet, amid all this confusion, one person was missing: Tina. She wasn't in the house, and there were no clues as to where she had gone. The authorities were called immediately, and soon, investigators from Plumas County arrived at the scene. The small-town law enforcement team was not prepared for something of this scale. As they entered the home, they were confronted with a scene of chaos and horror. The living room floor was stained, and 2 objects, a hammer and 2 blades, were left behind, telling part of the story. But there were many questions. How had this happened? Why had no one heard anything in the dead of night? Neighbors reported hearing only faint, muffled sounds, nothing that raised alarm. A couple living in a nearby cabin thought they heard a scream in the early morning hours, but it was brief and didn't seem urgent at the time. Other residents recalled seeing a green van parked near the Sharps' home, but no one could remember much more. What baffled investigators most was the fact that the 3 younger boys, Rick, Greg, and Justin, had been in the house the entire time but were untouched. They had slept through the entire night, completely unaware of the tragedy that unfolded just a few rooms away. This raised even more questions about the nature of what had happened. How could something so violent happen without waking the entire household? In the days that followed, the investigation took a darker turn. One name kept coming up: Martin Smart, a neighbor living just a short distance away. He had been acting strangely, and there were reports that he had recently lost a hammer, something eerily similar to the tool found at the scene. Martin was questioned, and though his behavior was odd, there wasn't enough evidence to hold him at the time. Even more disturbing were rumors that his wife, Marilyn, had received a letter from him shortly after the incident. In the letter, he alluded to having paid the price for her love for the lives of others. Yet, for reasons that remain unclear, this letter wasn't used as evidence in the investigation. As the community of Keddie reeled from the shock, attention turned to Tina Sharp. Her disappearance was as alarming as the events that had taken place in the house. For weeks, search teams combed through the forests and nearby areas, hoping to find any sign of her. Flyers were posted, and the FBI even got involved, treating it as a possible abduction. But despite all efforts, Tina seemed to have vanished into thin air. 3 long years passed with no answers. The case grew colder, and hope for finding Tina faded. But in April 1984, a break came. A man scavenging for bottles near Feather Falls, about 60 miles from Keddie, stumbled upon something horrifying: human remains. Among them were fragments of a skull and jawbone. The remains were later confirmed to belong to Tina Sharp, bringing a heartbreaking end to the search. Despite this discovery, the case remained unsolved. There were plenty of suspicions and theories, but no solid answers. Some believed it was an act of revenge or a deeply personal grudge. Others speculated about possible involvement with organized crime, pointing to John Bubita, a man who had been staying with Martin Smart at the time. Bubita had ties to criminal organizations in Chicago, but he too passed away before any definitive link could be made. In 2016, decades after the incident, new evidence surfaced. A hammer, matching the description of Martin Smart's missing tool, was found submerged in a pond near Keddie. Investigators were convinced that it had been deliberately placed there, a calculated attempt to hide crucial evidence. Even more chilling was the discovery of new DNA evidence on a piece of tape from the crime scene, connecting it to a living suspect. Though these discoveries reignited interest in the case, no arrests were made, and the mystery remains. The cabin where it all happened, Cabin 28, was eventually torn down in 2004, as if the town of Keddie wanted to erase the dark chapter from its history. But for those who lived through it, the memories can't be so easily erased. For the Sharp family, and for the community of Keddie, the haunting question still lingers. What happened that night, and why? The story of the Sharps and what took place in that small, unassuming cabin will never be forgotten. It serves as a reminder that even in the most peaceful places, darkness can creep in, leaving behind questions that may never be answered.